Welcome to Business Beyond the Mic, where we join Carly Van Heerden, CEO and founder of We Edit Podcasts. Together, let's uncover the art of podcasting.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. I'm your host, Carly Van Heerden. Today on the show, we welcome James Cridland. James is editor of Podnews, the daily podcast newsletter. He is a radio futurologist, a writer, consultant, and public speaker on radio's future. James has worked in audio since 1989 as an award-winning copywriter, radio presenter, and internet strategist. He launched the world's first streaming radio smartphone app in March of 2005 for the original Virgin Radio in London, launching daily podcasts earlier in that year. In 2007, he joined the BBC, working on the BBC iPlayer for radio, achieving a dramatic increase in the service's audio quality. As part of the team that laid the foundations for the UK Radioplayer, he has since worked for a variety of businesses across the world, including Canada's Vista Radio, receiver and silicon manufacturers Pure and Frontier Silicon, talkSPORT, the ABC, and a variety of media companies in Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia, helping them all to focus on the benefits and challenges that new platforms bring to their business. He was an advisor to podcast host Captivate, which was acquired by Global in December of 2021. During our conversation, James shares his incredible story and all of the lessons that he's learned on his journey to building Podnews to the success that it is today. He brings such a unique perspective, truly marrying his podcast with his daily purpose, which is bringing podcast news to life. From there, we dive into what it looks like to be embedded in the community that you serve, some fishing tips, and of course, all of James's incredible advice on finding the right partnership for monetizing your show. He also reminds us to dig deep into the metrics of your show, using the tools to your advantage and truly understanding how your audience listens to your show. James is such an integral part of the podcast industry, and we had a blast in this conversation. So without further ado, join us there. James, welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. It is such an honor to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for asking.
Yeah, well, it feels like a long time coming, actually sitting down, getting to chat with you. So, I'm super excited to hear everything that you have to share. I mean, you are such a pillar in the industry. You've got a finger on the pulse of what is going on with podcasting. And so why don't you just start us off by telling us a bit more about yourself, your business you ran, and of course, your podcast?
Yes, well, my name's James. I'm British, but I'm in Australia these days, and I started a newsletter about podcasting back in 2017, looking at daily news in terms of the podcast industry, and I've been writing that ever since. And it has two podcasts. It's called the Podnews Daily, which is a daily update, and a weekly podcast as well called the Podnews Weekly Review. Of course, I do other podcasts, but those are the big two. So that's basically what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just like, I love the style that you have for either one. It's because it's so unique. Like, you've brought your experience from radio and journalism all wrapped up into one place with your daily, news updates. And it's just such a joy to see that and to, I would be lost without your pod news every morning. That's the first thing I read, or,
Excellent.
My eyes are squinting to find out what's going on. So
that's the plan.
Yeah, honestly, just love what you've done with it. And it's just been amazing to see it all grow over the years. So just want to take it back a bit to when I know that you had this epiphany of, we should start Podnews. We should tell people about the news in the industry, because there really wasn't anything like that back then. I mean, I remember even starting our company, there really wasn't much with the podcast production side of things too. It was all people just doing it themselves. So what a better way to start something, to fill that need, to serve people in a way that is so helpful. But then how did it turn into something more like with the newsletter? When did you decide, okay, now the podcast is something that I need to step on?
Well, so we came up with the idea of the newsletter. I was actually at a radio conference in LA. It was called the Worldwide Radio Conference. I think it's as worldwide as your baseball is. But nevertheless, I think I was the worldwide, if we're going to be strictly accurate. But anyway, so I was chatting with a friend of mine in the pub afterwards, and he was saying, "James, where do you get your news about podcasting from?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure that there is anywhere really. There was one guy doing a quite lengthy newsletter every week, but that was very much focused on a particular area of the podcast industry and not the whole side." And so I thought, well, that's something that I can do. So came home, did a little bit of research, put something out within about a month or so, and just started writing it and seeing what would happen. So, so it was basically a chance conversation in a pub, which is always the best conversation, I think. And when I went to Podcast Movement for the very first time in 2018, it must have been, I think a number of people were coming up to me and saying, "Hey, so what's your podcast?" And I said, "Oh, I don't have a podcast. I just write about them." And I was wearing a Podnews branded shirt. And I said, "Well, I don't have a podcast. I just write about them." And after the 12th person had asked me, I thought perhaps I should probably have a podcast as well. And actually, it's been super useful because I've been able to understand a lot more. I've been involved in podcasting since 2005, but I've been able to understand an awful lot more about some of the problems that podcasters have because I'm doing my own. And actually, when you have a look at podcast hosting companies, it's interesting spotting those podcast hosting companies where the big bosses, the CEOs, are running a podcast and where they're not. You get a very different type of podcast hosting company, I think, if you have a CEO or a founder who is actually involved in podcasting day in, day out, rather than one who is just, a software engineer or something.
Yeah. No, and that completely makes sense. And it resonates so much with me too, because I spent many years just on the post-production side of things, and it was where I thrived. That was what my business was about. And now that I'm finally stepping right behind the mic, I've essentially become my client. I've been through my processes. I've been on this side, and it's been so insightful, and I've worked out a lot of kinks and actually just enjoyed working with my team a lot more from being on this side of things. And a lot of learning lessons.
I think you can learn an awful lot more. I'm one of those techie people that enjoys hosting my podcast myself, and that's actually given me quite a few news stories as well. Yeah. I should say that the reason actually why I launched the podcast, apart from people asking me, what's your podcast? And I felt embarrassed that I didn't actually have one. The other thing is, if you're writing a newsletter, and you'll know this, if you're writing a newsletter, the best thing to do right when you've finished it is to read it out. Because when you read it out, you spot all of the mistakes. You spot the spelling mistakes. You spot the repeated words. You spot all kinds of things. So reading it out loud is part of sending out a good newsletter. And I suddenly realized, if I'm reading it out loud, I might as well record myself reading it out loud, and that makes it into a podcast. Yeah. So that was that particular plan. So the podcast now goes, I think it's got listened to by about 50,000 people last month. So it's a decent size. It's also broadcast on the radio as well in the UK. So they take a version of it without any of the ads, which is always nice. So that goes on the radio in the UK. And it's available, obviously, on Google speakers and all that kind of stuff as well.
Oh, I love that, because it makes it so accessible, discoverable to such a wide audience that you don't even necessarily even think about as a podcaster, because you're kind of just focusing on your platforms. You're not thinking of that radio. So I love that perspective, and just opens your mind to thinking about where this can go. I mean, I've been diving into a lot of TikTok things lately because you got to learn about these things, and I'm finding so many funny and awesome radio hosts who have turned their segments into podcasts. And it's just such a hoot. Like, even from one of them I found was in New Zealand, and they are absolutely hilarious, and it's such great entertainment. And they stem from radio. So it's just nice to see it all kind of come together, which is great. Well, with your background as this tech guy, I mean, obviously writing all your own programs and coding and hosting your own podcast, did you have any obstacles or like learning lessons as you started with your podcast and entered into the behind the mic scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting. So I was behind the mic a long, long time ago in my career. I was a radio presenter, and I used to do a daily show on a radio station. With more than 1 million listeners, so that was fairly good. But then I hadn't done any of that for 15 years, so I was very rusty. I'd forgotten how to talk into microphones. I didn't, frankly, know quite what I was doing. And when it came to audio editing, I mean, when I used to edit audio on the radio, I was taking pieces of magnetic tape. I was grabbing a razor blade and I was cutting them up and marking out, exactly where the words were, and cutting out words that I didn't want, and then sticking it all back together again. And of course, right at the end of my radio career, I was beginning to learn how to edit on things like Audacity and those sorts of things. Interesting thing, by the way, the word fish looks like a fish in an audio editor. Wow. There's a thing. Wow. Anyway, so I was busy, learning that. But of course, 15 years later, I was there going, oh gosh, I've forgotten half of this stuff. Yeah. So I needed to kind of relearn all of the technicals. But, the actual just getting behind a microphone and stuff wasn't a worry to me because I'd done that as a job. It was more, making sure that it was a decent quality production that I would be, relatively proud of, I think.
Yeah. And I know you always say that when it comes to podcasting, it's about putting out great audio, and there's no way around it. If you're not doing it, why are you podcasting? But I know there's space for everybody, but I love that because we also focus a lot on making it sound great, being proud of what you put out there, and making it an enjoyable experience for your listeners. So yeah. I love that part of things. So once you kicked it all off, and as you were growing Podnews, what was the biggest benefit that you saw once you married the two, the podcast and the newsletter?
Well, I think the podcast managed to get more, in front of different people. And those different people, I mean, every day when you listen to the podcast, you'll hear me promoting the newsletter quite heavily and saying, please go and subscribe to the newsletter and all of that stuff. But it does get in front of people that otherwise wouldn't get the newsletter. So from that point of view, that was really helpful. And you could certainly see, that some people prefer a little piece of audio. I've lost count of the amount of people who've told me that they listen to me in the shower every morning, which is a little bit of a concern, to be honest. But still, there we are. So there are some people who enjoy that. There are some people who enjoy reading the newsletter. The newsletter, as I used to say in the podcast for more than a year, I said the podcast's good, but the newsletter's better. The newsletter obviously contains links to everything that I'm talking about. Contains more information. There are more features in there and everything else, because there's a limit, obviously, in terms of how much stuff you can cram into a podcast that's only 3 or 4 minutes long. But certainly, it's been really interesting seeing how both the newsletter and the podcast have continued to grow over the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah. No, and I mean, all of those things come with the territory. If you're going to provide them their news, you know when they're going to listen in the shower. That's hilarious. But yeah, I agree. The newsletter has such great features because obviously you can click through, you can read more about the articles, you can actually see where the news is coming from. It's a lot of different things. But as you were growing, not only the newsletter and your show, how did you go about, the community aspect of it, getting engagement? You have to be talking to the players in the game. You can't just be finding news on your, obviously you started out by, you said you shared like 4 stories per day. And if that was it, that was it. But how did you eventually get it to be that they knew that you were the person to come to sharing their podcasting news?
I think quite a lot of it is to do with consistency, just doing the same thing day in, day out, so that people understand what it is that you stand for. People understand how to get in touch with you. People understand, an old program director used to tell me that there was always a new listener every single day. And so therefore you should always, if you're going to run a feature, for example, on your radio show, explain it. Work out a succinct way of explaining what this feature is, so that new listener who's never heard you before completely gets it, completely understands, completely feels comfortable with what you're actually doing. And I think that is an important thing when it comes to being a newsletter writer, being a daily podcaster. It's all to do with consistency and making sure that you are always there. One of the mistakes I made when I was building the classified ad system for the newsletter was that I forgot about things like public holidays. And so therefore, I didn't build in we're not going to let you advertise because there won't be a newsletter on Labor Day or on Independence Day or whatever. And of course, that means that I publish every single year, even Christmas Day.
There you go.
Because there again, consistency, all the way through. So I think that was certainly part of it. I think also being at events like Podcast Movement are very important, to meeting people. I have a drawback in that I'm the other side of the world here in Australia, but I also have a benefit, because the benefit is that I'm working overnight for you guys. Normally, you've all gone to bed or you've finished sending me news stories anyway, so that by the time I am putting together tomorrow's newsletter, I've got all of the news that I actually need. That's great, but it's also a drawback in that I can't just pick up the phone and talk to people and check things and all of that. So quite a lot of it is seat of pants stuff, to make sure that I actually do it right. So, that means that events like Podcast Movement, last week I was at an event in Mexico, so making sure that, I was talking to some of the folks down there. All of that is really important, and just making sure that, I'm meeting people and talking to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because it puts you right in there. Like, you're not missing a thing because you're seeing it all roll out. You're seeing all the companies come together, the apps, everybody doing it. But I love that you said that you have to explain it in a succinct way, because who are the people using, whatever buzzsprout is rolling out? It's not going to be an engineer or somebody. It's going to be the podcaster who wants to use it for their podcast, and they need to know how to use it. How can I recommend my podcasts and things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I got a lovely email the other day from someone who said, I just want you to know that all of our new employees, one of the first things that we do is we tell them, go and subscribe to Podnews. It's free, podnews.net. Go and subscribe to Podnews. Make sure that you get that every single day, because it will really help you begin to understand this industry. So almost every single day, I'm writing for the person that has never hasn't got into this industry yet, the person that is just striving to understand who is Acast, who is We Edit Podcasts. Who are these people in the industry, and actually just try and explain who they are and where they all fit. And that's something which is quite hard to end up doing in a newsletter, which is theoretically only supposed to take 2 or 3 minutes to actually read.
Yeah. No, and that's true. Our company is the same. We're like, is everybody subscribed to Podnews? Are you getting all the updates? And I know my content director and we love to go through on like, oh, what are the new podcasts? Because I love the other thing that you've just launched is your trailers podcast. So you're just sharing some of the new podcasts that are releasing with their trailers. And it's such a great idea, because discoverability is, obviously one of the things that people always talk about. Like, how do I get people to hear my podcast? Where do I find new podcasts? And yeah, it's been fun to listen to those sneak peeks there. We have fellow South African Trevor Noah. I saw his popped up too with your show. And it's been nice to just keep a finger on who's putting things out there, what's new, and where to find it is obviously one of the big things. So yeah, do you have any tips for podcasters on discoverability? What would you say is one of the biggest ways to, make sure people are seeing what you're putting out there?
Certainly, being part of your community is massively important. So, if you're writing if you're producing a podcast about fishing in the nude, then you need to be involved in those Facebook groups. You need to be involved in those Reddit groups that are about fishing in the nude, or whatever it is that you might be writing about. Possibly not about that.
Yeah.
But
It's
being
an
involved
option.
in that, being involved in that, careful with that hook. Being involved with that community is important because people will see you as, hopefully not an argumentative person, but hopefully as a friend who is there to help.
Yeah.
And you can promote your podcast while you're doing that, of course, but actually taking part in these communities is really important. And on the other side, they will give you more news and more information about what it is that you should be making shows about. You will get new, interesting ideas from just taking part in those communities and making sure that you go to the equivalent of the events of, Podcast Movement or the podcast show in London or whatever it might be, making sure that you go to the equivalent of those events. Show your face, make sure that people know who you are. All that stuff is really important. One magic tip is to print some business cards that actually have QR codes that point to your website or point to some way that people can subscribe to your show. Because, a lot of people will say, oh, where you're from, and you say, oh, I've got a podcast and blah, blah, blah. And they'll go, oh, well, I'll subscribe sometime. Whereas actually, if you hand them a QR code that you basically say, scan that now while we talk. Then you know that you're getting more people, grabbing your individual show, and that's going to be a great step forward for you. But it's hard work, but it's really important.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I know you always say if you're doing things and you're not telling people about it, how are they going to know? So yeah, putting yourself in those places where you can talk about what you're doing and get people to actually see it.
Yeah, that's important. And it's important to remember 56% of Americans don't listen to a podcast during a month. There are a lot of people who do, but there are also a lot of people who don't. So we just need to bear that in mind. And actually, yes, absolutely, talk to other podcasters. That's a massive important thing. Try and be on other people's shows where you can, especially if the audience is aligning as well. But also, just make sure that you're out there elsewhere. You're out there in the coffee shops and in the communities that you actually exist in. I think that's also an important part as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more about building those relationships and being helpful, helping other people, and not just pushing, your own agenda, but actually engaging with what they're doing. So, yeah. So when you're doing these shows or giving advice to people about podcasting, what is your, key tip when it comes to the metrics? How do you know that you are, in fact, hitting home, getting to the point and helping people with what you're doing with your show?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my key tips on that are forget about the numbers. Just focus on the trends. Focus on the trends of, are you going up? And, is the amount of people who are downloading your show going up? What works in terms of marketing your show, in terms of getting your show out there, and what doesn't? That's an important thing. But I also think on the other side, there's so much information out there about your show and about how well your show is doing. If you take a look at Apple Podcasts Connect, or indeed at Spotify for podcasters, both of those will give you a dashboard with a ton of information in there. And the information is as detailed as what type of people are listening to your show, but also where they're skipping through, where you lose them, where they stop listening. All of that information is in those dashboards. It might not be in your podcast hosting dashboard because most podcast hosts don't have access to that kind of information. But certainly Apple, who control their player, and Spotify, who control theirs as well, has a bunch of additional information that's super, super helpful. So I would certainly have a look at that. And I would also have a look at just benchmarking, yourself in terms of how podcasts are actually doing. That's an important part, as well. And you will hear a lot of people who are talking about, 3 million downloads so far, and irritating people like me who say that my podcast reaches 50,000 people a month. But actually, if you go and you have a look at your podcast hosting company, they will probably have somewhere some helpful statistics. Buzzsprout.com, for example, if you go to buzzsprout.com/stats, then those stats will actually show you right at the bottom. They'll show you the average amount of downloads that a podcast gets in its first 7 days. And the average amount of downloads that a podcast gets in the first 7 days is 32. Not 32,000, 32. So if you're doing more than 32 downloads in the first 7 days, then you are better than half of the podcasts out there. So super helpful just to have a look at those. It's a very much more grounding thing than hearing all of these stories about people with, hundreds of thousands of downloads. The other place to have a look, and it's mine, so there's a disclaimer, but we also own the Podcast Business Journal.
Yes.
And if you go to podcastbusinessjournal.com/data, then one of those pages there will actually help you see individual shows in your category and see how many downloads they're getting and see how many unique users they're getting as well. It's a service called OP3, which is completely open stats. Some people don't want to publish their stats. Other people are quite comfortable about doing that. So if you want to go and have a look at more than 300 shows who are sharing their stats and data, then that's a good place to go and take a peek and actually see how other people in your category are doing, because I suspect you'll be quite surprised and quite pleased about how well you are actually doing there.
Yeah. And I remember seeing a stat on there too that like 90% of people don't even make it past their third episode, which is really encouraging to new podcasters starting. If you can make it past, X amount of episodes and you can stay consistent, then you're doing really great. So yeah, I love sharing that with people because everyone always like, what? I've done more than that. So I'm like, yes, good job. You're doing great. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Loads of people who start and then they realize, it's quite difficult, this, isn't it? But it's definitely worthwhile keeping going. Joe Rogan is a massive success in podcasting, but he is a massive success because he spent 10 years doing it before he was actually noted and, noticed, and people were actually really tuning into him. So it takes time to get there, but yeah.
Yeah, time with your podcast, time with your newsletter. That's all it really takes. You and just the heart behind it. It doesn't change. You're still out there to set out what you originally set out to do and getting after it. So yeah, I love it. Well, I know, James, you're no stranger to monetization and you have incredible tips. So why don't you talk to us about exactly what it is you do, how you monetize the podcast, and how the podcast and the newsletter kind of work together, or which one is helping which one?
Well, yeah. So we've got... So Podnews itself has two different podcasts. There's the Podnews Weekly Review, which is a long, I try and keep it under an hour and a half, but Sam, my co-presenter, is very keen at filling it. So there's that. And then there's the Podnews Daily, which is the podcast from the newsletter itself. Yeah. Now, the Podnews Daily, the way that we sell the advertising in there is that if you are the title sponsor, then you end up sponsoring both the newsletter and the podcast version. And that's a good justification, if I'm going to be blunt and open, that's a good justification for keeping our prices a little bit higher than they otherwise would be if it was just the email. Wow. So adding that podcast in there is an important, side, of that. Yeah. But when you have a look at the Podnews Weekly Review, I think that's a bit more like other shows that are out there. We produce a very specific show. The numbers aren't massive, but the show is listened to by some really important people. And we had a hosting company, Buzzsprout, coming to us and saying, can we sponsor your show? And we've had a couple of other sponsors as well in the past. But you don't need large numbers. You need the right people. You need the right people to be listening to your individual show. And, to come back to my rather strange example of nude fishing, there will be people, there will be, fishing tackle companies who will be super interested in marketing to that particular audience. So they don't need massive numbers. What they need is to make sure that they are reaching the right sort of people that want to buy, fishing rods and and warm blankets, things like that. So all of that is really important. I think that there is there's an assumption that you need at least 10,000 downloads in order to make any money from a show, and I'm not sure that that's correct. Yes, if you can't be bothered to talk to potential sponsors and you just want to sit back and let random people advertise on your show, then that's probably correct. But if you go and talk to individual sponsors, show them how focused your show is, then that's a super good way of you finding a sponsorship for a show that maybe doesn't have large numbers at all.
Yeah, and it actually truly just becomes a partnership with them and your show. And I know I've heard you talk about too, it's not always just the downloads, but it's how long people are listening to your episodes. Because if they are, just downloading it and not actually listening, how much value is that actually providing to your sponsors? But if you have those stats where people are listening to the full episode, or at least, more than 50% of it, then it makes much more of a difference for your sponsor as well. So yeah, I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love that view of it too. Yeah. Well, so James, I loved all of this and hearing your story. Is there anything right now that you are seeing in the future for Podnews and the podcast? And what are you excited about coming up?
Oh, I think that there's plenty of exciting things happening in the industry in general. From my point of view, I'm trying to keep up with it, and I'm trying to make sure, it's at the moment, YouTube is getting into podcasts. What does that mean for us as an industry? Is it good or bad news? I think it's good news for the listener. I think it's good news for the creator. It's probably bad news for the industry. But it's how we actually put that together and how we work out, where we're actually going there. So I think that that's certainly sort of one side of it. And what does that mean for the Podnews newsletter and all of that kind of stuff? I think, what I'm excited about are some of the new features that Adam Curry, who invented podcasting, and Dave Jones, who's an excellent software engineer, they're currently working on some really interesting ideas that will help podcasting continue to be, innovative and exciting as we move forward. And that could be things, like transcripts, like making sure that everybody can actually take part in podcasting. But it might also be different ways that you can earn money from the shows that you do. It might be different forms of shows. You might end up doing music shows where the music artists get paid for what they do and all of that kind of thing. So I think that there's a lot of very exciting things happening in the industry. I think from the Podnews sort of side, there are the three shows that we have: the Podnews Weekly Review, the Podnews Daily, and, as you say, the podcast which is called New Podcast Trailers, which just contains new podcast trailers. It's completely automatic. I wrote that code over a weekend. I was quite pleased with it. But I think those are really interesting to keep going. But it's just spotting what else is happening in the industry and whether or not there are other opportunities for us as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, that is exciting. And that episode with Adam was super interesting, and just seeing his point of view of how music and the industry has changed. I mean, thinking back, I'm from the generation of the kids who love to, grab the music not so legally, because it was just about the access to it, right? It's that the freedom about it. And yeah, it's just, I loved hearing his point of view on everything. And Yeah. And he's like, I've done some things that are wrong, but we're trying to fix it. So it's just that freedom of being able to put it in the hands of everybody and make it something that you can do, which is exciting. And the industry is changing super fast. I mean, I went away for a couple of years, and coming back, it was just like, oh my goodness, I gotta keep up. I gotta learn again. I gotta get back into what's happening. But it's exciting. It's fun. I love seeing all the updates. So it's going to be good.
No, it is. It is fascinating, and I think it's just keeping up to date with everything and just the changes in the industry. The big difference, I think, is that it's still a very young industry. It's still an industry which is growing, and different people jumping in and jumping out. If you remember, a couple of years ago, Facebook was getting into podcasting, and everybody was going, "Oh, this is going to be really cool." And Facebook dipped their toe in and then went ouch and ran away for some reason. I'd love to find out who at Facebook I should be talking about the inside story of why Facebook dropped podcasting almost as quickly as they picked it up. That would be super interesting. But so I think keeping up to date. If you're a serious podcaster, I think keeping up to date with the industry is an important thing. So hopefully we provide tools that might actually help people do that.
Well, I actually, speaking of Facebook, I watched snippets of Mark Zuckerberg's interview. They did it all in the metaverse with their goggles and everything.
Yes.
And the AI rendering. And it was super interesting, but also like, wow. So that maybe that's why they ran and they went that way. I don't know, but we'll see what they come up with next. It's exciting, but yeah. Well, now let's get to just a little bit of fun here at the end of my good old show, the quick fire 4 questions. So first off, James, how has podcasting changed the way you do business or life?
I think if I was still a radio consultant, which I was in 2017, if I was still just being a radio consultant, then I would be finding it very hard to pay any bills. So I think it's moved my enjoyment of audio and other things from radio into on demand, and I think that's been super good.
Wow, yeah, imagine that, hey. And now, what are your top 3 tools or like a non-negotiable investment as a podcaster?
I think in terms of non-negotiables, it's making sure it's really clear what your podcast does is a number one thing. The amount of podcasts which are out there, and they're called Real Talk. I think I last counted more than 150 podcasts which are called Real Talk. What was Real Talk? What on earth? Why on earth should I listen to your show? So making sure that that there's a good reason to listen to your show is, I think, the number one thing. Eric Newsom, in a book which I've got hiding behind here somewhere, Eric Newsom talks about 10 words. If you can work out the 10 words that describe your show, then that's a great step forward. And you'd be surprised how few podcasters can actually do that. So that's an important thing. I think from a podcaster's point of view, learning how to use a microphone is also a surprisingly important skill that actually very, very few people have. And you don't need to go out and buy lots of expensive equipment and the Shure SM7 that you're rocking there and all of that. You don't necessarily need to buy any of that stuff. What you do need, though, is you need to know how to use that particular microphone that you have bought. And you'd be surprised how many people will stick a microphone like that, or like the one that I'm using, which is the much cheaper Shure MV7, to put these microphones miles away. And as soon as you put a microphone miles away, then everything sounds really echoey and horrible. And so it's actually, just understanding how to use a microphone, how to use the equipment that you already have. And that's where success is, rather than going out and buying more stuff. And the third one, really clear thumbnails. Thumbnails are super important. Make sure that you have really clear ones.
And also, don't lick your microphone like my son does when he tries to come on the show.
Yes. I tell you, working in a radio station where everybody is really close to the microphone, in the days of, pre-COVID, as soon as one person had flu, everybody had flu. It was a terrible thing. You'd tune into the radio station and there'd be people, with colds 24/7. And it was a very strange thing. Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. I mean, for us, we ran a studio for a while too, which is where all the stuff comes from. I just repurposed it for my own use. But just keeping it clean every time someone used it. It's a whole thing. So,
No,
and
absolutely.
that was also pre-COVID. So we didn't even think about it as intensely as before, like now. Yeah. But it's good.
And by the way, I would also say get a producer or an editor who is not your friend. Because it's important that it's not your friend. It's important that producer or editor actually says, you know what, that doesn't work. Stop doing that. Get better at X, Y, and Z. All of the worst producers that I ever worked with were best buddies with the presenter who they were producing. And that doesn't necessarily make for the best. It makes for the best environment, of course, in the station or in a podcast, but it doesn't make for the best output. You actually need someone who is a bit more, critical to actually, help you make for a great show.
Yeah. That's where we come in. We're not going to tell you that we're going to fix your audio with our magic button. Please do it right and then submit your audio.
Correct.
Oh, well, switching gears here, was there one big fail or a learning lesson that you had over the years of podcasting?
There is an interesting question. I think really, the learning lesson that I have is to make sure that if you are saying slightly less than positive things about someone, then the best thing is just to tip them off that you're going to be saying, whatever it is that you're actually going to be saying. I think one of the problems that I've got is my time zone means that it's quite difficult to be first with news, but also to have always dotted all of the T's or dotted all of the I's. You don't dot T's, dotted all of the I's. Maybe that's where I've been going wrong. Of just making sure that every story is absolutely right. And so there are a few people who I've really upset, probably not actually meaning to, but just doing that. So I would probably say that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you're not podcasting yet, get podcasting. I think one of the things that I regret most, actually, is that I didn't start doing the podcast version of the Podnews newsletter earlier, and that I didn't start doing the Podnews Weekly Review, which is a much longer form, opinion-based thing. I didn't start doing that much earlier. I mean, we started doing that, I think, in 2021. So. And I would have probably rather that I had started that a little bit earlier as well. So, so don't wait. Just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I agree. My sentiments are 100% the same. So last one. If money or time were not a factor, what would be next for Podnews?
Oh, I think I would. I think I would definitely be hiring people. Podnews is just me, and that can sometimes be, particularly since I was traveling last week, and it turns out that Australia is quite a long way from everywhere else. If only I'd known that when I moved here. So from that point of view, keeping a daily newsletter going when you've got a 14-hour flight followed by an 8-hour flight, for example, which is how long it takes to get to Europe, is quite difficult. You need quite a lot of planning in order to be able to get that done. So I think probably hiring additional help would be super good, and would enable us to do a few more newsletters and focus a little bit closer on some of the audience who we actually talk to. So additional help is always a plan. And for other people who are listening, maybe additional help is someone to help them edit their podcast. You don't necessarily need to be the the specialist in using Hindenburg or in Adobe Audition or whatever the podcast editing software that you're actually using is, you can probably pay the expert to do that and actually free yourself up to focus more on the content of a show rather than the mechanics of actually getting stuff out.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's been, for me, a dream. I literally say, hey, team, the episode is in the folder. And then that's it. And they come back and they have it made. And I'm like, wow, it looks great. Thank you. And it's just, priceless. It's honestly priceless. So can't say enough. Well, James, this has been the most fun conversation. And thank you so much for taking the time to share all of your knowledge and wisdom with our listeners and our viewers. And I'm just excited to see what Podnews does next. And, we've got an eye on you every day. So.
Uh-oh. Well, thank you so much. And thank you also. Your company puts lots of really good, articles together, which we link to regularly, but probably not regularly enough. So thank you for putting those on, because those are super helpful as well.
Absolutely. And everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.